Good afternoon, all, and welcome to the Princeton School of Public and International Affairs. I'm Amani Jamal. I am the Dean of the school. I'm so happy to have you here today for our Dean's Leadership Speaker Series. As current events are making abundantly clear, the intersection of commerce, diplomacy, foreign policy, and international development is complex and ever-changing. Here at Princeton SPIA, we train our students who are tomorrow's policymakers to be flexible and adaptable so they can navigate this intersection in all of its various configurations. We also bring to the school special guests with direct experience to help illuminate its challenges and opportunities. We are fortunate to have with us today just such an expert, Meg Whitman of the great class of 1977. Has significant experience leading business organizations from startups to large multinational companies in Silicon Valley. And from August of 2022 until last November, she served as the United States Ambassador to Kenya. In that capacity, she had uncommon access and influence among the country's senior leadership, and she did much to promote Kenya as an attractive location for American investment. Ambassador Whitman's range of experience is Kenya, of course, is a country with which we are quite familiar. Over the last couple of years, our graduate students have visited Kenya on winter policy trips and for summer internships as well. And Princeton undergraduates traveled there with our Center for Health and Wellbeing just this last year as well. In addition, the university serves as a trustee of the Impala Research Center in central Kenya, a site of a semester-long field program for student research. Ambassador Whitman's range of experience is a perfect background to provide perspectives on U.S. Africa relations, economic growth, and the role of innovation in foreign policy. She previously served as the president and CEO of Hewlett-Packard Enterprise and the Hewlett-Packard Company, both multinational information technology companies. She also was the president and CEO of eBay Incorporated, the online marketplace and digital payments company. Ambassador Whitman has served on numerous corporate boards, including those of Procter & Gamble and General Motors. Committed to equality in education and protection of the environment, she has been the national board chair of Teach for America and a member of the board of trustees of the Nature Conservancy. Very admirable. A few brief reminders before we begin. Please listen respectfully and with an open mind. Remain calm and curious. And if you're inclined to engage with our speakers, please ask questions and don't give speeches. Challenge ideas, not people, and allow space for other voices. Thank you to Ambassador Whitman for joining us and to everyone in attendance for today's event, which is made possible by the Mason Morfitt Fund. And thanks as well to Princeton SPIA's Liechtenstein Institute for Self-Determination, which did much to facilitate the ambassador's appearance, and to Barbara Bookins, a research scholar with LISD, for moderating, and I'm very much looking forward to this terrific conversation. Barbara, Ambassador, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Amani, and thank you so much, Ambassador Whitman, for joining us. As Dean Jamal has said, you have had a long and distinguished career, primarily in the private sector, but also the public sector, perhaps exemplifying to students who may be close to graduating that there are many ways of being in service to the nation and to humanity. I think your tenure as ambassador to Kenya was remarkable in a number of ways. So I think the U.S.-Kenya relationship was strong when you arrived. However, I think what you managed to do was elevated in a particular way, both politically, culminating in the state visit right in May of last year, but also economically when you pushed, as Dean Jamal said, for investment in Kenya in particular. But before we get into some of the achievements and the priorities of your tenure there, I'd love to ask how you approached the position, right? Coming into this as you said, an unusual path, since you were not a career diplomat. You had a very close relationship, as Dean Jamal also said, with President Ruto and many people in the cabinet there, and you put a lot of emphasis on private investment and economic development. So as you went into the position, could you describe a little bit what your approach was and what you thought your priorities were going in?
Well, great. Well, thank you very much for being here. It's a privilege. And thank you for interviewing. Thank you, Dean, for inviting me. I really appreciate it. So I think I should start with a little story about how I ended up as the ambassador to Kenya. People say, how did you end up in that job? Well, I am a lifelong Republican, except for I endorsed Hillary Clinton and Joe Biden. And so I got a call from the White House in June of 2021, and it was Joe Biden who said, Meg, I want you to be an ambassador. And before I could say anything, he said, I want you to go to Kenya. And I said, Kenya? I was thinking France. And he said, no, it's because Kenya is the tech capital of East Africa, should be the tech capital of the continent. And I think your tech background would be an enormous help to the Kenyans. And frankly, Africa needs to be really important to the United States. And sending someone of your caliber will send a signal to the continent. So I talked to my husband of 45 years this June, and who is chairman of the Department of Neurosurgery at UC Davis. And I said, hon, how do you feel about going to Kenya for 3 years? And to his credit, he said, let's do it. And so he got a chance to train residents in Kenya. It was actually a wonderful experience. But sometimes in life, it's better to be lucky than smart. And I arrived after a year-long confirmation process, which was really rough. I arrived on August 1st of 2022, 9 days before the Kenyan national elections that occur every 5 years. And so I was new, and the president of Kenya was new. And he was the first president born after independence. He was also the first non-elite president of Kenya. Most of the presidents of Kenya have been the founding fathers of the country or their sons. And he wanted to know what I knew, which was economic growth and development. Because I think we both knew, and I quite figured out relatively early, that in many ways, so many of the challenges on the continent relate to a population boom. The population of the continent is supposed to go from 1.5 billion to 2.5 billion by 2050. 1 in 3 working age people will live on the continent in 2050. And so if the continent doesn't create jobs at a much more rapid rate than has been done in the past, there's going to be some very big challenges. So I became convinced that the number one thing I could add value as non-career diplomat is jobs, 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 and attracting foreign direct investment and helping to shape the economic investment climate so Kenyan firms could grow and thrive. So we worked together on what changes from a legal and regulatory standpoint would help companies, and then how do you change the narrative on Africa and Kenya? I know that when I was at HP and eBay, I thought about Africa 1% of the time. Yeah, I got it. But I got things going on in Europe and Latin America and Asia, and Africa's a really long way away. And I think the narrative among most business people in America is 30 or 40 years old. They don't understand the economic situation, they don't understand the demographics, and they don't understand the potential of many of the countries in Africa. So the very first thing we had to do was to start off by changing the narrative and then changing the regulatory environment to make foreign direct investment and, frankly, the Kenyan dynamic economy more able to succeed.
Wonderful. And to stay with that topic for a little bit, one of the things that you did was, which is quite impactful, was this roadshow,
yes.
The U.S. Kenya business roadshow in San Francisco and Chicago, right? And it was your, it was embassy, the embassy as well as the Kenyan government. I'm assuming you encountered a fair amount of why Kenya among the people where you traveled, and I imagine, right? So thinking about it from the business perspective. The Kenya's economy is 7th in the continent, and worldwide it sits a little bit below Slovenia. Did you have to convince them, and what did you do to convince them that this was in fact worth their while as a place of investment for the U.S.?
Well, you're right. The Kenyan economy, the GDP of Kenya is the same size as the GDP of Nebraska, just for perspective. And so I think the first thing was, we trialed this with the American Chamber of Commerce annual meeting in Kenya. By the way, the American Chamber of Commerce around the world does some pretty good things. Not every place is great, but actually the American Chamber in Kenya is the best I've encountered in 60 countries. And there was a fantastically talented Kenyan who ran it. And we created, because I knew we had a narrative problem, we created the story of why you should invest in Africa and why Kenya should be your destination. And the executive summary here is every company needs to diversify their supply chain. If the Russian invasion of Ukraine taught us anything, you have to have a diversified supply chain. You know, when Russia invaded Ukraine, we were all asked to get out of Russia. Okay, no problem. 4% of the sales, move out. If you asked us to get out of China today as head of HP or head of eBay, forget it. I mean, it would take years. And so this diversification of supply chain, even from places like Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, I mean, everyone has to have a more diversified supply chain. And then secondarily is, if you're going to diversify your supply chain, why don't you go to a place with more than 93% green energy so you can hit your Scope 2, Scope 3 emissions goals? And Kenya has 93% green energy. Again, better to be lucky than smart because it's all geothermal in the Rift Valley. Some wind, some solar. But geothermal in particular is fantastic because it doesn't rely on wind or sun, and it's constant. And by the way, it's cheap, which is less than 5 cents a kilowatt hour. So that was sort of the pitch. And then we told the story of the workforce and all the things, you know, a gateway to East Africa of 500 million people. And then the tech capital of East Africa. And frankly, they call it Silicon Savannah. And so we just told the story. And it was an enormous success because at the Chamber of Commerce, we had mostly Kenyans. Interestingly, this is a very interesting fact about Kenya. Normally, when you go to a country, the people that are running the American companies or the British companies or the Dutch companies are not native. Okay, so like IBM would not be run by a Kenyan. You know, Mars Wrigley would not be run by a Kenyan. This is a testament to how good the Kenyans are. Virtually every American company in Kenya, the division is run by a Kenyan because they're so smart and so entrepreneurial and like get it done. And so the Kenyans thought this presentation was amazing because they said, we didn't even know this about Kenya. You know, we've told ourselves a less than optimal story. And now this has given us confidence to tell the story to the headquarters of our companies. And so then we decided to test market it in New York. I usually don't test market things in New York, but we were going there. And so we decided it was a good idea and really to quite great acclaim. And then I brought the president to Silicon Valley. And President Ruto had never been to Silicon Valley. And it's so interesting to go to a place like Silicon Valley with someone who's never been there and to basically explain to him that 60 years ago, this was orchards. And now, you know, California is the 5th largest economy in the world, the same size as France. So that was very helpful. And then all of this culminated in the state visit where we really got to help Kenya tell their story. And just a couple of results. So venture capital and foreign direct investment. Kenya is now the #1 destination for venture capital on the continent, more than Nigeria, more than South Africa, which have economies much bigger. And then secondarily, foreign direct investment, we're now the largest foreign direct investment destination on the continent, I think because of the story we told. But I also need to underscore, for those of you who are policy people, creating an investment climate that allows companies to thrive is crucial. And I'll give you 2 examples. So Kenya wanted to be the leading destination for venture capital, but they had a tax on unrealized gains of stock options. Okay, so let's say you went to work for a Kenyan tech company and you got $10,000 worth of stock options. The government wanted you to pay $3,000 upfront before there was any liquidity to the shares. So the Kenyans weren't able to do this. Americans wouldn't be able to do this. So they had to decline their stock options. But the whole point of going to work for a startup is that those stock options might be worth something. So I went to the president and explained this, and he said, well, we should change that. So they did. The second thing was tech companies were required to have 1/3 domestic equity holders. So in other words, a tech company would have to have 1/3 Kenyan shareholders. And I said to the president, okay, if you want Amazon to come to Kenya, there's no way Amazon is spinning off Amazon Kenya and selling 1/3 of it to Kenyans. It's not happening. So it will never happen. So you need to decide if you want these big American tech companies, you have to get rid of this rule. So he goes, that makes sense. And then 8 weeks later, Amazon opened with 300 people in a development center in Kenya, and they now have 900. So and there was 7 more. I mean, the tax code, for those of you who are Kenyan, the tax code in Kenya is very inscrutable and also has been weaponized to some degree by the Kenyan Revenue Authority, which is the equivalent of the IRS. And that needed to get fixed. And so, which is in part getting fixed. So we did 9 of these initial recommendations about changes that you could make to the investment climate. And I think without that, had we just told the story without the substance, it wouldn't have worked. But if we hadn't told the story and did the substance, it also wouldn't have worked. So the lesson is, what's the story and the narrative combined with real policy changes that enable success?
Fantastic. You mentioned a state visit, and I think there's substance and a narrative there.
Yes.
So for students, I mean, I think you probably all do know, but it's incredibly difficult to get that organized and to get on the agenda in that manner. For Kenya, it had been 21 years. And even if you just look at the African continent, right?
It was the first state visit by an African head of state since 2008.
Right, and that was then President Bush. So this is a remarkable achievement. What do you feel the narrative was like in Kenya? And important things happened at that meeting, including, right, obviously there was the investment pillar too, but also they were designated a major non-NATO ally. So what do you feel the narrative was around the visit from your vantage point in Kenya? And what do you feel is doing going forward? We're 1 year on almost from the visit. What types of fruits is this bringing us?
So first of all, I think the Biden administration really did understand it was time for an African head of state. And so really it was, and I might have had something to do with this, if you're going to pick a country in Africa, probably our most loyal ally on the continent is in fact Kenya. A 60-year partnership between Kenya and the United States, fighting terrorism in Somalia, al-Shabaab, lots of trust between these countries. And for all Kenya's challenges, it is probably the most stable democracy in Africa. Not perfect, but a very stable democracy. So the Biden administration decided to invite President Ruto. And then it fell to the two teams in Kenya and in the United States to lay out an agenda that helped to tell this story. And we wanted to lay it at, so then Jake Sullivan called me and said, hey, he can, he's supposed to come to DC on Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, but we'd like him to go to Atlanta on Monday and Tuesday. I'm like, Atlanta? Why are we going to Atlanta? And he said, we think politically it's important. And so then we had to figure out what we were going to do in Atlanta. And what we did, every politician has challenges. Many of you probably know that President Ruto was brought up before the ICC along with President Kenyatta, and for the violence around the 2007, 2008 elections, where I think 1,000 people were killed. And so that was a searing experience, I think, for Kenyatta and for Ruto. But I also said, you need to, I have a philosophy in life, which is if you have a problem, run to the fire, okay? Like, don't try to avoid, don't try to hide, address the issue. And so I recommended to the president that he make his very first speech landing in America at the Carter Center for Democracy. And I said, this is where you address the issues around the ICC, around democracy in Kenya, et cetera. And so we started off there. Then we went to Coca-Cola, that was making a $100 million investment in Kenya. Then we went to Tyler Perry Studios, because Kenya is very interested in the creative economy. Okay, no one in Kenya has done anything to help the creative economy. It's already 5% of the GDP. Tourism is 10%. So think about that. If you've got momentum and no one's done anything, maybe if you did something, you'd have like a bigger creative economy. And as you know, Nigeria and South Africa, probably Nigeria in particular, owns, Nollywood and the music industry on the continent. So we went to Tyler Perry Studios, and that was a fantastic experience for the president. And what Tyler Perry has done in Atlanta, do you know this? He bought a military base and turned it into 14 sound stages, and has taken a huge chunk of Hollywood's business to these sound stages. And it's really a remarkable thing. So, and then a Kenyan entrepreneur was opening her first store in America, in Atlanta. And so we visited the store to talk about, Kenyan export, and we laid it out in such a way that it covered all the bases. And then obviously went on to the formal program, which had a climate component. This president is a scientist. The good news about President Ruto, and there's some challenges here, is that he's a scientist. He has a PhD in biology and ecology from the University of Nairobi. So he actually is left brain, and he is a scientist. And this is very helpful. And he wants conservation and mitigation of climate change to be one of his legacies. And so we had him give a fantastic talk and a panel with, at Johns Hopkins Climate Auditorium there. So we just tailored it to speak to all the different things that we could do together.
Fantastic. On conservation,
Yes.
I know this matters a lot to you. This is close to your heart. You were in Kenya 2 months ago, I believe. Yes. You're on the advisory board of the Kenya Rhino Range expansion. What do you think Kenya should do, or what do you hope they will do to help the long-term survival of its black rhinos? And then perhaps more apropos, what do you think Princeton should do? What do you think Kampala should do?
Is Ali here?
I don't know if Ali is here, but we can relay the message.
He knows what I think. So we have a president who cares a lot about conservation. We also in Kenya have a CS of tourism, a CS of the interior, and a head of the treasury that is all about this as well. And that's important because you have to, and by the way, the communities in Kenya that own a lot of the land, there is more land outside the national parks that's owned by community conservancies than there is land inside the parks. There's more animals outside the national parks than inside the national parks. So part of the magic of what Kenya has done is enfranchise communities. There's 190 countries that have agreed to preserve 30% of their land by 2030. Kenya is at the head of the pack with 26.7%. And so they are all about trying to get to this next level. But what really has happened is many of the community conservancies have become somewhat degraded. So we decided to do two things. First is to put together with the Nature Conservancy an overarching program with the government of Kenya about how to get to 30% of their land conserved, but with financial sustainability. Like, how does this maintenance of the land, how does this hiring of rangers, how does it fences and drones and all this, how does this get paid for in a country that is quite strapped? And so I said we need to do something that's quite innovative. So the Nature Conservancy has done 4, or maybe 5 debt for nature swaps. What they do is they take high cost Kenyan debt, which by the way is very high cost, because when we raised interest rates in the United States, we get a head cold. A country like Kenya gets the flu because they have a risk premium on top of a risk premium on top of a risk premium. So they're rolling debt now at 15%. And so you swap high cost debt for low cost debt that is guaranteed by either Development Finance Corp or the World Bank. And then that savings, the government agrees to put into conservation. That helps them because then they can use government funds for other things. And so we are working on doing a debt for nature swap. They've done it in Belize, they've done it in Gabon. And these things are quite durable. They've got a board of directors of a trust fund that there's real penalties if they don't live up to this. And the Nature Conservancy did this in Gabon. 2 weeks later, there was a coup. And the Nature Conservancy is like, oh man, this is not going to be good. But it survived the coup because of the penalties and why it was so good. So we're doing that. And then the first project is what we're calling the Kenya Rhino Range expansion. And black rhino have gone from 30,000 black rhino in 1980 to 300 black rhino. Now, in the last 10 years, up to 1,000. And it is all about black rhino. But actually, what it is about is employment and benefit to communities. Black rhino is the capstone species that allows you to conserve land, that allows you to put more game camps in community conservancies and in national parks that then create jobs, not only direct jobs like rangers, but indirect jobs. Think about what a game camp buys: meat, linens, toilet paper, and then, of course, employs the guides. So, and remember, this is very important because the GDP of Kenya, 10% is tourism. So if you could double that without cannibalizing something else, that's a real economic growth lever. So there's 2 landscapes we're working with. One is Tsavo, down almost on the coast, which is, if anyone has seen a map of Tsavo, Tsavo is the size of Switzerland. You forget how giant this continent is. It's mostly national park. And what they need there is more room for the rhino. The rhino conservation efforts have worked so well, the rhinos are out of room. So we just need to drop the fences in Tsavo National Park and then put some more game camps there. The one in Laikipia, someone here is from Laikipia. Anyway, is more complicated because it is government land. it is private conservancies, and it's community conservancies. But they have all agreed this would create 20 new rhino conservancies. They've agreed to drop the fences and let the rhino roam. Now, the linchpin to this whole thing is impala. And I think you guys know the story of impala. I mean, I think what happened was there were these two brothers who owned impala, and like one day you all got a letter that said something like, hey, it's your lucky day, you own 55,000 acres in Kenya. And so what I've really asked Princeton to do is to agree to put at least some of impala into this rhino range expansion so the rhinos can go to north to the south. And the first question I got was, well, aren't rhinos dangerous? Well, yeah, they are, but like there's rhino fencing, you know, like they're not going to be marauding through the impala research facility. And they said, well, what about our research? I said, you keep on doing the research. And by the way, you invite students to go do research on rhinos and tigers and, I mean, not tigers, lions and giraffes and zebra. I said, this is the greatest thing that could ever happen. And by the way, because we're raising money through TNC, not only through the debt swap, but also philanthropically, you don't have to pay for it. So I think it's a really excellent opportunity. I did say to you earlier that watching Princeton make a decision on this is a little bit like watching ice melt. But, and then someone said to me, yes, but Princeton's the fastest moving university of all the Ivies. I'm like, great, that's great. Meanwhile, we need rhino range expansion land. So anyway, but I think we're getting there, and it's really going to be important. And I think it'd be great for the researchers, great for the students, great for faculty. I mean, it's 55,000 acres is huge. We just forget, you know, envision the continent of Africa, and then near the tip of Somalia to the Kenyan-Somalia border. Somalia, the tip of Somalia to the Kenyan-Somalia border is Maine to Miami.
Right.
The trip from Nairobi to Dakar on the other side of the continent is like going from New York to Hawaii. I mean, it's absolutely huge. And so these are some of the great landscapes left in the world with some of the most important biodiversity, and it is key to employment and community empowerment.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Final question, and we'll open it up. You mentioned Kenya is one of our most loyal ally. There was a lot of trust. We sort of hinted at it in an earlier conversation, but I think we should broach it again. President Ruto is in China right now for a state visit until Friday, I believe.
5 days.
Yep, 5 days. And so this is being reported, right? So this is reported as a strategic win in Chinese media, and I believe also in Kenyan media. What is your sense of what the U.S. can or should do in relation to China's role on the continent?
Well, so everyone in this room knows there is a great power competition between China and America for influence on the continent. Why is that? Because of the natural resources, rare earth minerals, and the demographics. Remember, 1 in 3 working age people are going to live on the continent in 2050. And the Chinese have been in Africa for 2 decades. The Belt and Road Initiative has built most of the bridges, the hospitals, the roads that exist in many of these African countries. And they are very interested in influence. I think under the Biden administration, and maybe a bit before, we had begun to wake up to the fact that half the battle in life, this is a great lesson for you all, half the battle in life is showing up. Mm-hmm. Okay, if you don't show up, you have no chance. And we hadn't shown up, but we started to show up, and I think in a really good way. And I can speak for Kenya. I mean, we really did show up. And then under our current administration, I believe we have actually stopped showing up. I don't think this administration understands what happens when you eliminate USAID in a country like Kenya. I mean, it is. If you said to Kenya, we need to have less dependence on us over a 5-year period, and here's what we're going to continue. We're going to continue PEPFAR, and we're going to continue humanitarian aid, and we're going to continue this, as opposed to wake up on a Monday and say, it's gone. Like, they cannot cope with this because this is a very indebted country. When I came to Kenya, 29% of the budget went to debt, interest, and principal payment. When I left, it was 59% of the budget. Because, as I said, when we raise interest rates, they get the flu. And so they're in a very constrained financial situation. So we eliminate that, and then basically, I think, communicate to the African continent that the continent is no longer important to the United States. And you will recall what President Trump called African countries in his first term. And now the rumor of eliminating the Bureau of African Affairs, et cetera. So what we are doing, inadvertently or on purpose, is we are ceding ground to the Chinese. And I know that what happened here is that when we eliminated USAID, within a week, Xi was on the phone inviting the president to a state visit in China. And if you're the president, what do? You obviously have to go, because you can no longer count on what we will do as the United States of America. And you have to hedge your bets. 15% of their debt is Chinese debt. They've got to have help on a number of different issues. So you go. And by the way, I think almost all the African countries now, well, certainly more than half, have joined BRICS. And Kenya has joined BRICS. So I think it's really, I mean, my personal opinion is this is unfortunate.
Right. Thank you so much. Wonderful. We have time for questions from the audience. And yeah, go ahead. And whoever gets the, there's this one first, second. Although we can, yeah, go ahead. Okay, first, second. There. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ambassador Whitman, for coming to speak to us and for your great service in Kenya. During your tenure, you faced significant criticism early on from opposition leaders, and then later on from the younger population who accused you of meddling in the country's internal affairs and expressed concerns over your perceived closeness to President Ruto's administration. So as someone transitioning from the corporate world to diplomacy, how did you navigate such challenges and maintain your focus on promoting the US-Kenya business interests amid such tension and scrutiny?
Yeah. So part of the pitch of why Africa, why Kenya, was that Kenya is the most stable democracy and had the freest, fairest elections in Kenyan history. I didn't say that. That's what observers said. By the way, there were 11 different election observers in Kenya who basically said this was the freest, fairest election in Kenyan history. I incorporated that into Why Africa, Why Kenya, and gave a presentation at I think it was the Homa Bay Investment Conference, where I gave the Why Africa, Why Kenya presentation. And one of the first things I said was, here's the things that would recommend Kenya to an investor: most stable democracy with the freest and fairest elections. The only problem, not unlike America, is half the country was on the other side. And the other side went nuts, just nuts, because they thought I was declaring that this was the freest and fairest elections. I didn't say I thought it. I said observers thought it. It doesn't matter. In politics, when you're explaining, you're losing. And so they took that to mean that I was, an what's the right word? Unfettered supporter of the president. And that what happened in the Kenyan elections was, when the election took place, Odinga did not actually contest the election. 6 months later, he was an election denier. And then his party rallied around that, and I walked right into that. And that was, I think, by the way, when you make a speech as the United States ambassador, like the whole embassy reads your speech before it goes. I mean, there's like a zillion fact checkers there. They send it to Washington. I mean, it's like, and no one caught it. No one said, Meg, you're walking into a problem if you say this. And it would have been easy to just say it's the most stable democracy in America. Next. But I didn't. So that was the sort of the thing that actually made a lot of Kenyans who were mad at Ruto because he hadn't tackled corruption. He hadn't tackled a lot of things that the youth in particular were bummed out about. And I took a lot of heat for that. And guess what? Here's the good news. I ran for public office. I get it. But it was a mistake. I mean, in the perfect world, I would not have said that. And then there wouldn't have been a hook to hang me on. And what, of course, people in Kenya don't know is behind the scenes what I was doing to, sort of help get him on a little bit more of the right path. So.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Whitman. I'm Gitu Kongene from Kiambu County, and I'm an MPP student here.
Nice.
First, thank you so much. I think your articulation of Kenya is very impressive. I can vouch that, all that you said, stands true. So my focus is on tech policy, specifically AI. And in light of everything that's happening, and you've called out Kenya as, a very strategic country as far as digital evolution on the continent is concerned, how do you see Kenya-US partnerships evolving in light of the current AI evolution? And particularly as the US explores diffusion and an emphasis on fostering trusted technology ecosystems abroad. Of course, with the Chips and AI Act and the diffusion rule and everything, and with your background in Silicon Valley and a firm understanding of what's in the country, how do you see that partnership evolving? Thank you.
So Silicon Savannah, which is the sort of shorthand for Silicon Valley in Kenya, Silicon Savannah, is real. I mean, this has the opportunity, I do believe, to sort of revolutionize Kenya and, frankly, the continent from a technology perspective. And this today, every industry is a technology industry. Agriculture is a technology industry. Fashion is a technology industry. Biology, biopharma is a technology industry. So it's super important. And because we have been present for a number of years in Kenya, IBM is there, Google is there, Cisco is there, Microsoft is there in a big way. Microsoft and G42, which is the AI national champion from the UAE, is building a 1 gigawatt data center in the Rift Valley because of all the green energy. And so there's a great technology ecosystem complemented by M-Pesa and everything that M-Pesa has brought to Kenya and to the continent. In case anyone doesn't know here, M-Pesa is the largest mobile wallet in the world. And it was a homegrown Kenyan initiative that basically created a platform that is very different than credit cards. So the buyer pays the fee is teensy, and it only works on mobile. And so everyone in Kenya has a mobile phone. Everyone is effectively banked. 99.9% of the people have an M-Pesa account. And catch this, 70% of the GDP goes through M-Pesa. And they have an open API platform with 60,000 developers. Think about that for a moment. And it's well over $1 billion company, held captive at the moment by Safaricom. It's a division of the telco in Kenya. It's like as if it was a division of AT&T or something. So anyway, so the ecosystem there is very strong because of a big tech company that could seed talent, i.e. Google or Microsoft or Safaricom, very good universities from a computer science perspective, and then venture capital, right? That's the magic of Silicon Valley. Great big tech companies that can seed talent, great universities, first with Stanford, and then last is the venture capital headquarters of the world. And you'll be interested to know this. 90% of the venture capital into AI in the last 4 years has gone to San Francisco, not the Bay Area, San Francisco, the city. Can you believe it? 496 companies have been started in the last 12 months in San Francisco. So this is the idea here, is that you get this ecosystem that becomes its own momentum. Now, the challenge here is most of the infrastructure, the IT infrastructure in companies, in the government of Kenya, is provided by Huawei. The entire backbone of the government of Kenya is Huawei. And so part of the challenge here, Huawei, for those of you who don't know, Huawei is the leading technology company in China. They're the networking company of China. And so again, back to this great power competition, we have to show up. And I do think that the American companies really do understand the opportunity in Kenya, but we've got to make sure that we continue to show up in the face of a deprioritization, potentially, of Africa in the context of this administration. Did that answer your question? Great, thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Whitman. My name is Jeremy, and I'm also a Kenyan, born and raised, and junior in the computer science department, and a proud resident of Whitman College. And
Yay!
So I had a question about, so in Kenya, innovation is moving much faster than regulation at the moment. And we see a lot of developments that are just unprecedented. And just this past week, we saw like an $800 million cryptocurrency pyramid scheme breaking down in both Kenya and Nigeria. And I wanted to get just hear about your experience about how to attract investment and also how to innovate ethically in such a landscape where the technology is moving so much faster than the government.
Yeah. So I think this is not only a challenge for Kenya, it's a challenge for almost every government. I'm not sure we figured out how to regulate crypto here. I'm not sure how we have figured out how to regulate iris scans, which was a big issue, as you know, in Kenya. So I do think, and again, this is where policy is so important. How can the government of Kenya figure out how to get ahead of this and regulate in a way that is appropriate without stifling entrepreneurship? And that's always the balance. You know, I liken it to fly fishing. You're going to think I'm nuts. But if any of you are a fly fisherman, when you're fishing, you've got to get the fly right in front of the fish. If it's behind the fish or too far out in front of the fish won't bite. And so this is the same with regulation. How do you actually think about getting the regulation just right? It's a little bit like the three bears, you know, not too big, not too small, just right. And that's hard. And it's very hard for governments. I do think that Kenya is trying, but frankly, there needs to be, in my view, either an African approach to this regulation led by the AU or a worldwide body around this. Because if Kenya does one thing and Nigeria does another and South Africa does another, and then all the European countries are doing something else, this makes it extremely difficult for companies to go forward. And one of the things that Kenya agreed to do on the internet tax is abide by the three-pillar OECD framework for internet taxes when that becomes available. And the president said, well, I don't understand why we need to do that. And I said, because if someone's making an investment in your company, you want the least amount of blockages to go forward. So if you've got a different tax regime than everyone else, then maybe I don't go to Kenya. So that's why I think this has to be, and these are really hard to do. I mean, honestly, I don't know how they get ahead of this. It's very, very difficult. And then once you have a problem, as we did with Sam Altman's, you know, company with the iris scans, I mean, they're still trying to sort this out, and it's 2 years later. And I did say it's also not a great idea to put one of the three founders of your company that is doing this, you know, holding them overnight in jail. Like, bad idea. Like, really bad idea. Please don't do that.
There and then there. Maybe start there with the student and then. Yeah, you go first.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. During your talk, you talked extensively about tech as a way to grow in Kenya. So my question would be in regards to a specificity of the tech sector is that it oftentimes doesn't require that much labor to operate. So I think NVIDIA is like a $2 trillion company with around 30,000 employees.
Yep.
So my question is, considering the scale of how many people there are in Kenya who probably have the opportunity to get higher wage employment and other things, do you think the path of development for Kenya is one purely or primarily driven through tech? Or do you think tech has to be a source for capital that has to be then reinvested in other industries?
So when I first came to Kenya, many people said to me, Meg, I mean, because Kenya is still 70% of the GDP is agriculture, like most African countries. And they said, except for like Nigeria, which is all oil and some of it all others. But anyway, they said, why don't you just go from agriculture to digital? Forget manufacturing. Let's help Kenya industrialize in a way that is unique. And for about 5 minutes, I thought this was a really good idea until I did the math that you did, which is the number of employees per dollar of revenue of a Google is a fraction of the number of employees per dollar of revenue of a manufacturing firm, whether that's apparel or electronics or solar or EVs or whatever. And so if you are going to try to keep up with Kenya going from 57 million people to 100 million people by 2050, by the way, there are 1 million new 18-year-olds every year in Kenya, which means you basically have to create close to 700,000 jobs because the population is aging through better healthcare and things like that. So you're not having as many retirements or deaths. you have to create 700,000 new jobs a year. That's a lot for a country like Kenya. But the only way to do it is get manufacturing. Back to supply chain diversification and incentives. Now, this is where another thing I'm quite worried about is in this tariff situation we find ourselves in. I don't know how many of you know, but AGOA, the African Growth and Opportunity Act, has been incredibly important to many African countries. There's probably close to 500,000 Kenyans who are at work in manufacturing companies that export entirely to the United States. Most of the apparel in Kenya is exported to customers like Walmart, Levi Strauss, Contour, Wrangler, etc., the Children's Place. And by the way, so is agro-processing, whether it's coconut chips or etc. And so if AGOA is not renewed in the fall of 2025, this is a huge problem, a huge problem. So I am quite worried about the sustainability of this now quite robust manufacturing sector, quite robust apparel sector that could be in jeopardy. And so, you know, even a 10% tariff on this will make it less competitive. And the country's done a lot because in order to really be a fantastic apparel exporter, you have to vertically integrate into cotton, both synthetics as well as real cotton. And so they've put a lot of farmland back into cotton. Cotton used to be one of the #1 crops from Kenya. And so they put a lot more back in. But if all of a sudden the demand is gone, what's going to happen to not only the farmers, in addition to those who are working in the factories? So I'm with you. Factories, manufacturing has to be a part of any economic development plan. Otherwise, you can't absorb the youth bulge that's happening in these countries.
Trump has done is irreparable, and how much of it the remedy the Crown Court has.
Maybe just wait for the microphone to make sure that everybody heard the question. Thank you so much.
How much of the damage that Trump has done in this area is irreparable, and how much of it might be remedied after he leaves town?
Yeah. So the honest answer to that question is I don't know. Trust, and so much of our foreign policy is built on trust. You know, the post-war economic, political order is largely based on trust and people of goodwill. Are we perfect? Are our allies perfect? No, but the allies make a huge difference here. Who do you trust? Who do you go to in a time of crisis? And my worry is that once trust is broken, it's like your reputation. Maybe you've spent a lifetime building a reputation. It can be vaporized in a moment. And then it's really hard to build your reputation back. It can be done, but it's hard. And so I don't know the answer to that. My worry is that once trust is broken, and it's not just between Kenya and the United States, you look at Canada, our dearest and closest ally. It's really quite extraordinary. Canada, Mexico, the Europeans. I mean, my personal point of view is the one thing I learned as a diplomat is America's role in the world. And you would think I would know that, right? I was the CEO of 2 Fortune 50 companies. I don't think I understood it until I lived outside the United States and looked at from the outside in to America. And the president said to me once that I thought was, he said, Meg, America will take a lot of grief. We love to, kind of call you names. We love to tell you how much we don't like you, but we can't do what we do without you. You have moral authority. You have economic help that can be utilized to us. You help settle crises, and whether that is the Sudan crisis or the Al-Shabaab crisis, we can't do this without you. Your role in the world is incredibly important. The world would not be as good a place if America was not playing the role that you've played for much of the last 60 years. And for those of you who want to be in government and public service, I want you to remember that because it's really true and it's really important that we get really smart people in the foreign service and frankly in government. And so what does it take if that trust is broken? Can it be brought back? I do think people are hedging their bets. There's no question. I mean, Canada's hedging their bets, right? We're going to sell our resources to anyone but you. So I think this is a real challenge, honestly. And I don't know how it's going to shake out. I really don't.
In the back?
I can probably speak. Two questions. One involves
AI, and you mentioned, what was it, 1 gigawatt?
That's 1 gigawatt of power.
Right. So is Kenya finding itself able to, I'm going to say, finance its power needs, or does it need outside help with that? And then the second question, totally unrelated, has to do with the black rhino population. I was actually just speaking to a gentleman down in Texas who makes annual trips to Africa, not Kenya, and he told me why he doesn't go to Kenya. That's because of the black rhino population having fallen so much, and the fact that Kenya, in his opinion, hasn't done much to protect the black rhino population, having, and you said, falling from what, 30,000 down to 300 up to 1,000. And one of the reasons that this gentleman pointed out, in his opinion again, is that there's a lot of poaching that goes on with the black rhino population. Could you just comment your thoughts on, how does Kenya control that poaching today and in the future? And then also just kind of the power needs and, whether or not Kenya is self-financing those needs.
So Kenya is not self-financing. This this big 1 gigawatt data center in the Rift Valley is actually financed by a combination of Microsoft and G42. So Kenya does not have the capital to do this. So this has to be outside capital. Now it can be foreign, it can be Kenyan banks and other things, but the government certainly does not have the capability to do that, at least right now. With regard to the rhino population, you probably know that rhino poaching was a big problem on the continent as a whole for much of the 80s and 90s. And that's how this went from 30,000 to 300 by 2000. And then Kenya got in the game, not only on rhino, but also elephants. And they put together the Kenyan Wildlife Service. That it turns out the wildlife in Kenya is owned by the government. And the Kenyan Wildlife Service basically decided we are not going to allow any poaching. And they've really had virtually no rhino poaching for much of the last 12 to 15 years. And that's because for every rhino in the country, there are 2 Kenya Wildlife Service rangers that babysit the rhino. Okay? And so if you add another 1,000 rhinos, you add 2,000 in jobs because they babysit the rhinos. And if it's a mother and a baby, you have 4 rangers. And so that is how they have controlled poaching. They've also used technology. They've used drones. They've used other kinds of things. They're also rhinos. The Kenyan Wildlife Service can shoot to kill if they see a poacher and they catch a poacher. They can shoot to kill. So they are super serious about this. And it has also been true for elephants. The poaching of elephants has almost gone to nothing. And as you know, in Kenya, there's no hunting allowed, I think, since 1987 or something. Unlike Tanzania, which still allows the hunting of the elephants and the big tuskers. And you might recall the ivory from the elephant tusk. They found a huge stash of ivory, which then Kenyatta burnt in Nairobi National Park. And now the price of rhino horn and the price of elephant tusks is down by like 95% in a place like China. So they've done a remarkable job in the last 10 to 15 years, but they were down at the turn of the century down to 321 rhinos. And it's taken 20 years to get up to 1,000. We hope by this rhino range expansion, dropping the fences, et cetera, we can get to 4,000 by, I think, 2035 or 2045. They're breeding, they're doing great. They just need more room to roam. And back to rhinos being a capstone species, if the land is being maintained and rhinos can graze and rhinos are reproducing, so are elephants, so are giraffes, so are zebras, so are antelope. So the health of a landscape can often be defined by how the rhinos are doing. So I think it's a good story, actually.
In the back. Last question. Oh, two
together.
2 together. Good. Both in that side. Yeah. Right there and then there.
Hi, thank you so much for coming today. My understanding is that a major contributor to Kenya's designation as a major non-NATO ally was Ruto's willingness to put boots on the ground in Haiti for the multinational security support mission. And I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about what it was like as ambassador building that security partnership and coordinating a US-funded Kenyan-led military operation off the coast of Florida. Thanks.
Yeah.
Fantastic. And second question, last question, you, sir.
Hope I can remember two in a row here.
Oh,
That's okay.
Shikamo Ambassador Whitman. In summer 2024, protests struck in Kenya against the finance bill that was highly approved by the IMF. This finance bill was a tax reform that was supposed to increase the taxes in Kenya, and people, of course, revolted against it. People died, and the bill hasn't passed. Do you believe that the passing of the finance bill would have helped the Kenyan economy?
Okay, good, both very good questions. So the first question was
Haiti.
Haiti. Okay, so there was not a quid pro quo here, as I understand. In other words, you do Haiti, you get to be a non-NATO ally. But what President Ruto also understood was that, and this was his leaning in hard to America, honestly, was if we can be helpful in Haiti, that helps our overall relationship with the United States of America. And when asked, because he took quite a bit of criticism from Kenyans about this, because they're like, gosh, you know, you're sending Kenyan police to Haiti. We have our own set of problems here. And he said, listen, here's what I think. My view is that Haitians are Africans in a different part of the world. And as African brothers and sisters, we need to do what we can to help Haiti and help our African brothers and sisters there. Now, as you know, Haiti has been a mess for 117 years. I mean, this has, the history here of Haiti is very difficult. But he decided to send his police, and what the Americans agreed to do was to give a certain amount of money, I think it was $100 million in cash to the Haiti mission, and $100 million in equipment, you know, for the place where the Kenyans would stay, and the ammunition and the helicopters and the planes and all that. And what I understood, having watched this unfold, is saying that and actually delivering that level of support were two different things. And it was one of my most difficult things as an ambassador, which is my country had said we're going to do $100 million in cash and $100 million by the DoD in-kind contribution, and that's not what was delivered. So he's done the best job he can. I'd say it's stasis in Haiti. I don't think it's that much better, but it's not gotten worse. And I don't know if that's a success or not, but he was very committed to it. And I think ultimately sort of got the country to understand why that was. So, and it was, so I think the most difficult part was we asked him to do it, and the UN asked him to do it, but then we didn't deliver what we said we would. And that is a big problem in my view. And the question was?
Tax bill.
Oh, the tax bill, yes. So the difficulty, and I alluded to this, of the Kenyan economy is this. 29% of the budget went to debt and interest payments, as I said. That went up to 59% as we raised interest rates. And that meant that in order to get out of this organically, you've got to grow the GDP at 6 to 8% a year, and you've got to create 700,000 new jobs. Otherwise, there's no way out of this debt squeeze. And so part of what he decided to do was to raise taxes. And my view was, at the time, this is a very dangerous political thing to do. Like, you know, most Kenyans don't love paying more taxes. Most Americans don't love paying more taxes. I don't care what your political persuasion is. And, but he decided to do it anyway. And the communication around this, as students of politicians and politics and policy, you know that communication is as important as the policy. And the communication around it was terrible because they said it was going to be on milk and it was going to be on eggs and other things. Well, those had been actually taken out of the finance bill before it was launched, but no one knew. And so that gave the excuse, I think, to Kenyans in general to say, you know what, we've had it and we're not going to take it anymore. Enough. We've had it and we're not going to take it anymore. And so that led to the dissolution of the cabinet. That led to putting in a whole new cabinet. That led to probably heavy-handedness by the police. And remember, what he also did was bring out the military to defend State House. And he said to me, Meg, I thought about whether or not I should bring out the military to defend the State House. That's a little bit, that is a red line that you cross into authoritarianism. And I said, why did you do it? You just, you know, and he said, Meg, have you noticed the belt of African countries that have had military coups over the last, you know, 2 to 4 years? If they'd gotten to State House, that would have been the end of me. And so he said, I didn't want to do it. but I couldn't let State House be compromised. And so, you know, this is part of what being an ambassador is about. You think this is not quite the right thing to do, but you sort of, only he understands the context that this is happening. And you have to just use, sometimes you win, sometimes you lose in terms of what you think you can accomplish. But it was very well thought out, but probably the wrong thing to do. And then he didn't sign the tax, then the tax bill was shelved. And I don't think they've even put a new tax bill in since then. I think, you know, it's still, they're running on the 2023, you know, revenue model, which is a challenge here. The financial situation facing all of these countries, they did something that American companies did. When debt was basically free, we just all loaded up on debt. Like, what's not to like? You know, 0% interest rate. This is great. And of course, what is happened with many of the debt of these African countries, it's all floating rate debt. The Chinese debt is all floating rate debt that finance the SGR. It's all floating rate. And so all of a sudden, you're in a very difficult situation when you onboard 0% debt that turns into 7% debt or 8% debt. And that's what's happened here. And then new debt is being rolled, as I said, at a much higher level. And there's two kinds of debt in Kenya. There's the commercial shilling-based debt, and then there's the IMF, World Bank, bilateral lending debt that is largely denominated in US dollars. And it's the shilling debt that is through the roof. You know, the commercial banks in Kenya are lending at 15 to 16%. And it's actually, it's a whole nother story, but the commercial banking sector in Kenya is the most profitable banking sector in the world. Because what they do is they lend to the government, they get paid, and they lend at very high rates. And what the president is trying to do is to wean these banks off of sovereign debt, so they're forced to lend to companies, which is what local banks, commercial banks should be doing in the country. So nothing is what it appears to be. It's a little bit more complicated. So
Thank you so much. We're very honored that you are here with us.
thank you.